How's everybody doing? Thanks for being here. I had a feeling this was going to be kind of a more intimate conversation, although the intimacy continues to dwindle, and that's okay. I'm excited. I'm thrilled about this conversation because this is actually a conversation that I've never been a part of before. My name is Jacqueline Lazú. I am the curator, the guest curator this season here at DPAM of the exhibition Tengo Linkin Park en mi corazón. So exciting, so exciting. So it closes on the 8th, February 8th. So if you have friends who have not come to see it, please get them to come to see it. I don't know when it's going to happen again, right? When we get to tell this story again, it feels like the window's closing. And I've always said that with this work, right? That the window opens and then it closes. And there's so many factors behind that, but I won't get into it now because this conversation is going to be far more important. I'm going to have each one of the panelists introduce themselves in a minute. But first of all, I want to share that this is actually the last program of the series that we put together for the exhibition, although you still do have time to check out the exhibition a few more times. As usual, I have to thank DPAM, Yonit, Bejar, Laura Caroline, Phoebe Collins, Bernardo da Costa Suarez, the students, the interns. For me, it has been beyond emotional, beyond deeply personal and moving to quietly visit and see the way that this community has embraced this exhibition and this history. I was just having a conversation with someone who asked me what it feels like to have this story being told here at DePaul, and I'm sure that I didn't share the right words because it's something that, you know, when I started this work over 20 years ago, going on 25 years ago, I could never have imagined that it would have taken place, and certainly not in a space like this. This is a really special space, and this partnership has been an amazing, amazing privilege, a learning experience for me. And one of the biggest lessons that I've walked away with is the power of the image, right? The trusting that images can tell the stories that need to be told. And that's kind of the conversation that I wanted to have with this panel here today. The series of programs that we put together really centered the arts, and that was on purpose because while this story has been deeply marginalized by institutions that really could have positioned it differently in the stories that Chicago tells about itself, okay? In fact, it was the artists who did a lot of that heavy lifting. You know, artists remembered it through images, through propaganda, through the poems, through songs, and the stories that they told through their perspective. And so I wanted this exhibition, since it is in an art museum, I wanted to honor artists, okay, throughout this process. And so the first program that we had really focused on film and the images of, and the work that Iris Morales did in New York in particular, documenting this history. We also had a beautiful program just this weekend on bomba music, traditional Afro-Puerto Rican music, and songs from the movement that were put to bomba rhythms. That's amazing, and I'm sure we'll get to hear more about it. And then today I wanted to pay tribute to this idea of the image, right, of art and visual aesthetics and the role that that plays in telling the history, especially of civil rights movement and social justice movements in general, right, history. So, I want to make sure that I thank our sponsors, and I want to especially thank the Vincentian Endowment Fund in the Office of Mission and Ministry. It's been instrumental for us to be able to put these programs together. The Department of Modern Languages, the Center for Latino Research, the Richardson Library Special Collections Department. All of these stakeholders are truly invested in this history, and I thank them for their commitment to that. The panel today like I said, is a dedication to image making and the visual culture in the movement and movement building and the enduring impact that that can have. Images today function so differently, and hopefully we'll have a conversation about that today with our panelists. But it also complicates, adds some level of complexities to how we remember things, right? Because they're still, right? They freeze history for us in some ways too. And so that process of what it is that we choose to read in these images becomes incredibly important. Today, we're also gonna be hearing from people whose work has been connected directly to this aspect of the Young Lord's work in Chicago, across generations, really, and through different pathways. In Chacha Jimenez, the chairman and founder of the Young Lords, in his view, everyone would be a Young Lord, including all of you here today, because anybody who had an interest, right, and had a commitment, and in one way or another was curious and engaged in the struggle was part of that movement. And that wasn't always easy for people to understand, but that's one of the things that really distinguished Chicago from other chapters, right, is that there was never a moment where it stopped in his view. This was a protracted struggle. And so all of us are here today participating in that next stage of the movement. And so, I invite you to think about it that way, because that's certainly the way that I have imagined it in my forthcoming book. This was actually meant to be a book talk, but, as publication gods would have it, we're still a little bit delayed on that. The publication date is forthcoming, March 17th, hopefully in time for my next birthday. And but this is a really special project. All of these people here on the panel are actually represented in this book in some way. That's another thing that we all share on this table, because they all have, like I said, a direct link to the struggle itself, right, to the movement itself. And I'll let them talk about that. The book is being published by Haymarket Books, and what makes it so special is the fact that I've had the incredible privilege to have been involved in the slow and steady process of recovering a lot of these materials, of finding a way, a purpose, and a vehicle, an avenue for allowing, right, to create a space for the Young Lords to be able to speak for themselves in Chicago. It was a different type of movement, and it took us this long to get here, but I'm super proud of the work that we've been able to accomplish. There are many other stories that I'm sure many of you will be able to tell. This is just the beginning. And it introduced me to this process of curation, right, and narratives. And I'm really privileged, like I said, to have been able to work so closely with members of the Young Lords. And so last but not least, I wanna always thank members of the Young Lords, right? Those of them who are present here today, but also those that have been part of this journey who are no longer with us. The book and its aim is really to get people past the purely aesthetic experience of looking at archival materials. In today's world, in today's sort of internet-driven world, it is far too easy for people to use archival materials just for how they look. And it's a lot more rare for people to sit down and actually read materials or interpret materials. And so my hope is that this book will facilitate that. So today's exercise, however, is to have these people actually speak about the images that they either introduced to us through the exhibition, Tengo Lincoln Park en mi corazón, or I asked them to choose any other image that they felt has been left out of the conversation and that they want to kind of bring back in. I asked them all to prepare about 5 minutes of commentary on each one of these images. I'm gonna ask them to stick to it. I'm gonna come up with a plan. I don't know what it's gonna be. I don't know if it's like rabbit ears or if I'll tap on the table or something, but can we all agree about 5 minutes? Because we wanna be, the important part is that I really wanna make this a dialogue. I want to talk to them specifically about, the images themselves or related questions, and then I want you all to also be a part of this conversation, okay? About anything really that we've brought up here, but I feel like this is just a really important moment for us to talk about images circulating and what it means to revisit these historical images in some cases and these processes in a world where increasingly we're losing some level of control, in my view, that we're losing some level of control over the creative process and the interpretation process, right, in history making. So without further ado, I'm gonna start out with the first image. Go ahead. And this is, Areli is gonna introduce herself and tell us about her image.
Hi, my name is Areli Lupercio. I am a DePaul alum. I'm class of 2011, so right around, like she said, 25 years ago that we started this journey. I also took a class, if anyone's familiar, with Brother Mark, mural painting class, and this was kind of where I gathered all my intel to make this mural proposal. Before I start, I just kind of want to give you guys all an idea to keep in the back of your head. How do we visually carry revolutionary ideas forward without freezing them in the past? And that's kind of like the theme for my mural proposal. I am going to split it up into 4 parts because there's a lot going on. This is also a building that you guys have probably seen. It is adjacent to the Chicago Public Library right there on Racine and Fullerton. It's obviously the blank wall, but that's where I envision this. So if you look at the top left corner, you will see obviously the Puerto Rican flag. And to me, this was important to be represented in Lincoln Park because most people assume Puerto Rican flag, Humboldt Park. But that erases the Puerto Ricans from Lincoln Park, and which is really what the Daily and all of them wanted to do. So to me, it's like, bam, in your face, you see it. Then, all power to the people with the fist, again, just to symbolize that this is about the people. If you look to the bottom left, you see the Young Lord's Party. Now, this is a little bit incorrect, but we could talk about that. Again, I wanted to show the history, and I put them right under the Puerto Rican flag on purpose to, again, symbolize kind of where they originate from. If you go to the bottom right, you see, it's kind of hard to see, but it's like a bunch of dots, and they're supposed to represent anyone. Like, it's supposed to be ambiguous, that it can be any one of us. And the only sign you can read says, "Stop moving us." And that goes to any community that has been displaced due to gentrification, low income, all that. Well, anything that's happening in current events as well. So I felt like that was very important, that was the only one you could read, because again, it's still very relevant. Those red houses you kind of see, I wanted to actually, literally, figuratively show what the Young Lords did in the community. It's hard to read because I know it's a picture, but I put daycare free, food, tutoring, clothing for the people. Everything that the Young Lords did with the help of some churches and other organizations was for the people, was for the community. And lastly, if you look at the top right, you will see the late Reverend Bruce Johnson Jr. and his wife Eugenia Johnson. For anyone that is not aware, they were murdered in 1969. The case is still unsolved. However, it is highly speculated that they were murdered due to their affiliation to the Young Lords organization. And to me, again, this was very important to have them symbolized because, let's face it, I mean, a white martyr can be more sympathetic to the viewer than people of color. And they do deserve the recognition because they did put their lives literally on the line for fighting for people's rights that they felt was, being trampled on. And I also hope that seeing all these different images would encourage people to really then research, like, who is that guy? You know, why do they say Young Lord's Party? This, to me, would be perfect, like I said, adjacent to the Chicago Public Library because it's free. It gives access to children, to the DePaul, to the community in general. And I think it's something that you can't ignore when you see a big mural like this.
Great, thank you. Next image. Carlos is not with us today. His health is keeping him from being here with us today, and the weather. But I did chat with him, and he wanted me to talk about the image that he chose. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about it because the points that he wanted to share were pretty clear and pretty direct. But I will say this. So Carlos Flores is a photographer. Carlos actually became a photographer after he was kicked out of school, right around the same time that Chacha was kicked out of school, and went to a program at Argonne National Laboratory, okay? They both went to this program that was meant to sort of get kids from the inner city who had been in trouble, who had been involved in the justice system, to take on a hobby, to take on a task or a trade, and Carlos took on photography, okay? And he proceeded to document everything he possibly could about Puerto Rican Chicago, and very specifically, Puerto Rican Lincoln Park, which wasn't a huge community. It was actually a relatively small community. Lincoln Park was very unique, though. Unique in the city of Chicago, and in many ways, one of the things that I talk about in my work is precisely the conditions that were necessary to create a group like the Young Lords, being very particular to the longer history of Lincoln Park. The Puerto Rican community of Lincoln Park, like many other communities, were displaced. Many other working class communities were displaced from the lakeside communities to the east. It spread out in a lot of different directions, but one of the most robust landing spots was Lincoln Park. And there, they created a small ethnic enclave. And I often talk about it as a diverse community, and it's true. Lincoln Park was quite diverse at the time. There were a number of working class, poor and working class immigrant communities in Lincoln Park, nothing like what you can imagine today. But at the same time, Puerto Ricans were very, very strongly segregated. So it's an anomaly, right? Like it almost seems like a contradiction. I can't think of the right word for it, but diversity and segregation functioning at the same time and in the same space, okay? That was Lincoln Park. And of course, that's embedded in the larger history of systemic segregation in Chicago. But when you look at that phenomenon at the community level, it's a different thing. It's a different circumstance. So you have these enclaves, and I always refer to the 2100 block of Bissell, because if you wanted to live amongst the Puerto Ricans, you would want to live at the 2100 block of Bissell, okay? That was kind of like the heart of the Puerto Rican part of Lincoln Park, okay? Now, there were families in other places as well, but that had become the small ethnic enclave of Puerto Ricans in Lincoln Park. This particular picture was actually not in the 2100 block. It was actually in the 900 block of Bissell. And Carlos wanted to share it because of two things. He wanted me to share that what he found so interesting in this picture was the different groups of children and their ethnic backgrounds that were represented here. Some of the major groups in Lincoln Park at that time, for example, were the Romani, or who they called the Gypsies back then, okay? Puerto Ricans, poor whites from Appalachia, and Native Americans, okay? And So this picture sort of shows all of that, and it shows how even within this framework of segregation and ethnic enclaves, that children always found a way to come together. That children created new types of spaces. And then young people had a different way of imagining themselves in relation to these spaces, right? So they kind of created new communities of their own. They always crossed these boundaries, children, right? And part of it was their unwillingness to concede to those boundaries that were set up for them, right? To understand. So for example, he has another photo that he was debating, including where you see children not too far away from the Adams play lot, where some of the Young Lords say they originally organized and came together, okay? And you kind of see in that photo Adams play lot around the corner, but the children are actually playing just against the fence in an abandoned lot, right? So it's just this idea, again, of children creating their own spaces of community. The Adams play lot would have been a difficult place for everybody to play together, right? Because there was so much tension in the community, right? It's fighting for space, the kind of battle for territory, right? So for children created their own spaces to play. The last point that he wanted me to make, and it's somewhat unrelated to the photo, but it helps explain to some degree why Lincoln Park was interesting and attractive to Puerto Ricans. Like, what was it about Lincoln Park that was so beloved to this community? And you know, obviously, we talk a lot about the affordability. We talk about issues of diversity. We talk about a lot of things that are related to that history. But we don't talk enough about the impact of culture and space, right? The intersection of culture and space. Lincoln Park reminded Puerto Ricans of Puerto Rico. Having that lake in the summer to walk to and to have picnics and to bring the family together, you felt like you were in Puerto Rico, right? The barbecues along the park and along the lake, right? It was like visiting the beach back home, right? And time and again, when I hear stories about Lincoln Park during that era, that's what I hear, is the memories of summer in Chicago, right? And you all who are Chicagoans know what I mean, right? Like, you forget about summer in Chicago until summer in Chicago arrives. And for Puerto Ricans, being able to do a relatively short walk to the lake, right, with their families, and to be able to recreate that was really important to them. And so that displacement then becomes really significant and really different for us to interpret. So I'm gonna stop there and move on to the next image.
Yes, so I'm Ricardo Levins Morales. And this, I have some pieces in the other room that were created in more recent decades, but this is a cartoon that I created in 1971 when I was 15. And I'll pivot back to the significance of that, but I want to basically use my time to set the stage a little bit. In 1967, my family moved from the mountains above Maricao, a very rural community in Puerto Rico, to the south side of Chicago, an area where there weren't, it was not very Boricua heavy. My parents had been involved in the anti-colonial movement. I had some of those ideas in my head, and from an early age, I was going to protests and, visiting when students were on strike and all of that. But it were several events in the summer of 1969, the summer and winter, the police murders of Manuel Ramos from the Young Lords, of Chairman Fred Hampton and Mark Clark of the Black Panthers, that in looking back, I realized was a real shift for me from being a kid who went to protest to joining organizations and actively being in organizing. And my first organizational home was the Black Panther Defense Committee. But I would take and my father would sometimes come up to People's Church to teach classes on the history of the Puerto Rican movement, since a lot of the Lords were too young when they came or were born here to really, they were hungry for that knowledge but didn't really have it. I would take the Halstead bus from Hyde Park, get off at Armitage, which if I recall correctly, takes about a month. And part of it was just because I wanted to be around Puerto Ricans, right? So the kind of black-white dynamic in Hyde Park and then coming up here to be among Boricuas, the coming together of the Rainbow Coalition really brought it all together for me. And I would bring bundles back to my neighborhood of the newspaper. I was standing outside of the high school with the Young Lord's paper on one arm and the Black Panther newspaper on the other arm. Nenuri Saunders from the band, Black Student Union, came marching up to me, planted herself in front of me, squinted into my face and said, "What are you?" And then immediately recruited me to help put out the BSU's underground publication. And that kind of identity boundary, border violation was a lot more common in those days before the era of the nonprofits made identity into a brand to be defended. So this cartoon, like I said, I made that during my brief stint in high school. And in 1971, you see the little date in the corner. And it represented what we all knew what was going on, the government. And it's represented by Uncle Sam because the distinction between different levels of government didn't really mean anything to us. But Uncle Sam manipulating people on the street against each other. And we didn't have access to the documents that we do now, like the gang intelligence unit that was actively pitting street gangs against each other so they wouldn't become politicized like the Young Lords or the Young Patriots or follow in the footsteps of the Panthers. But we knew what was going on anyway, and that the sort of energy of the moment and the kind of organic analysis of what we were experiencing is kind of what was expressed in this. It's about division, which is the fundamental way in which rulers rule the ruled, right? And which we're seeing now with the amplification of fascism, which requires the dividing of people because otherwise they might figure out what the F is really causing them pain and hardship and point the finger in a direction that they're not supposed to point. I'm going to bank my extra minute for later. It's kind of like carbon credits.
All right, John, you're up.
Yeah, I didn't grow up as a Chicagoan. I grew up in New York City. And I came here to go to the School of the Art Institute because they gave me a free ride in 1966, and I needed that in order to get an MFA so that I could teach. And when I arrived at the Art Institute, the School of the Art Institute was down in the basement back then. And so I came there with my little cardboard suitcase and asked the secretary for the whole school, who was sitting out there in the hallway, Mrs. Goodrich, I think. And what do I do for housing? And she said, get on the L and get off at Fullerton and look. And that was their housing service. So I found actually a place very, very easily at that time on Altgeld. But I think that I got involved with trying to, with the Panthers and with the Young Lords, basically as a way of trying to make myself at home in Chicago, because I was deeply shocked coming from segregated New York City to find that Chicago was much more heavily segregated than New York City. Much more heavily segregated. And I couldn't believe it. So I had to get myself back into a more diverse setting, and I had been brought up already starting in high school to become political and to picket and do all of those things, distribute pamphlets and so forth and so on. And so that's how I think I first got involved. And I don't know the exact circumstances, but in '68, of course, there was all the excitement of the Democratic Convention, and immediately following that, the woman who was running Silkscreen at the School of the Art Institute, I had already graduated, but she opened the shop, the Silkscreen shop, to everybody, anybody who wanted to learn Silkscreen in order to be able to do posters for the movement. So, of course, I went there right away, and I learned Silkscreen pretty quick. It's not difficult. And I set up a Silkscreen shop in my studio where I was living. At that time, I was no longer in Lincoln Park. I had moved north, but I was on Broadway, and my space was right above a flower shop, and so forth. And so I set up I was teaching at Elmhurst College already, and I set up a shop, sort of an open studio for people to learn Silkscreen, for other people to learn Silkscreen. And in that context, I think is how I got to be doing a poster. I did a couple of posters for the Young Lords. And the first one was Come See About Cha-Cha, when Cha-Cha had been arrested. And the second one was that I still have someplace in the house, was an announcement about a festival in People's Park, which was, I'm trying to think, was right across Sheffield? Was it?
Armitage and Halstead. Armitage and Halstead.
On Halstead. There was a big space where the old bungalows and stuff had been torn down, and I'm sure it's all luxury housing now. But for a few years, it was claimed by the Young Lords and others as the People's Park. So that was also a poster that I remember doing.
I think it's a bank now, even worse.
I did some posters relating to the Panthers as well. I still have a copy of one that is about after the assassination of Fred Hampton. And those of you who are interested in Chicago history might take a look at that whole question of the suppression of the Panthers and of the course of the Young Lords and the Young Patriots and et cetera here in Chicago, because it was extremely violent, and Fred Hampton was very specifically targeted. You know, it wasn't just like a random shootout in the street, something there were some Panthers that had gotten killed in California that way.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're running out of time to hear from you, and I wanted to ask you if you had some thoughts that you wanted to share about Unidos para Triunfar, specifically the mural from 1971.
Well, what happened was that I and Bill Walker and a couple other early muralists were invited by the Museum of Contemporary Art to do a show in their basement because the director was broke, I think, and he thought that we would do it for free. And we demanded that they pay for all the materials and they give us a little something. And so the question was, they thought that we were going to do stuff and just give it to them. And instead we said, no, we're going to do it for community organizations that we know, and the stuff that we paint here is going to go to them. So I went to Omar and asked him, what should I do about it? And because I knew the Young Lords already, but the Young Lords' place had already been painted up. And he said, go and see my older brother, Obed, out in West Town, who was one of the people running, it was the main person running an organization called Latin American Defense Organization, otherwise known as LADO. And I worked with them and around the edges of LADO for the next 10 years. But the work that I did at the Museum of Contemporary Art was inspired by my contact with them, and I think it's still in the exhibit here.
We're about to see it, in fact. So this is actually a really great segue to the next image, because of course this is the iconic image that you can see as part of Tengo Lincoln Park en Mi Corazón. And by the way, hopefully we'll get a chance to hear a little more from John, but he has not even begun to cover the impact that he's had on mural art here in the city of Chicago, and especially the development, the framework, right? The support system for Latino mural art in this city. But Omar, you can add to that conversation by talking about this iconic historical piece, Fuertes Somos Ya.
Okay. Thank you. John, you see it? It's yours also. Right? Just before I start talking about this image, I just want to acknowledge that the presence of Juan Gonzalez here with us. Juan Gonzalez was one of the founders of the Young Lords chapter in New York. And then he went on to become famous, even more famous as a journalist, and then Democracy Now! And now we're very fortunate to have him living in Chicago. Well, Chicago. And also I want to mention that I remembered also that we participated in the Young Lords in some of the presentations that your father used to come and give us, Professor Levin. Yeah, and so he shared a lot of the history of the movement in Puerto Rico and the history of Puerto Rico, to the point that every member of the Young Lords was able to even cite dates and events of the Puerto Rican history. So that was very helpful to us. And then John, he's very modest. He's just talked a little bit about himself, but he had a big impact on the popular art in those years. This mural, well, it's actually, I think it's like 3 panels. And it was done for the Latin American Defense Organization. And when I was asked to pick an image, I picked this one for several reasons, because I think it depicts a model of community. And I think it's something that even applies to what is going on today and what we need today. And you can see on the left-hand side, it's a whole line of young people and a woman with the symbol of Lado on her dress. And they are, in essence, resisting the police. And it's the youth, and then you can see by the berets, they represent different youth groups of the time. And that is, of course, the purple beret, the Young Lords. You had the yellow berets with the Latin Kings, and behind is the red ones, which were just the Latin counts. It could be the Latin counts or the Spanish Lords, and then Lado. So this is a line of, I like to see it as a line of resistance, a line of protection of the community, because then behind them, you begin to get a whole, different activities going on. You see different symbols that represent things that go on in our community. You have the symbol of this lady over here holding like a cup, and it's a symbol, whether it could be Espiritismo or But of course, it's been depicted as just as a symbol. It's not, the person holding it is probably not a leader of that religion. But nevertheless, it's a symbol. And of course, the child is being elevated, which represents the future of our communities. So we have the youth, carving out safe spaces for our community to develop all of the rest of the activities. You have young people, women, workers, and I think that's a model of a community. We have to have something like this, especially today, of everything that is going on. We see a lot of the young people, and not just young people, older adults that are beginning to confront, in this case, ICE, to be able to protect the neighborhoods and to be able to make the communities and members of the community to feel safer, in spite of the attacks from federal agents. And so creating that kind of barrier, that kind of resistance, so that our community can continue to thrive. And that's something that's very difficult because there's a lot of fear in our communities today. So a lot of the activities that are going on have stopped, But one of the things that we are trying to promote, being very intentional about it, is art. We're saying that all movements create art. And I think this is a good example of the 60s, created images that represent all of the activities that were going on in those years. I think that what is going on today needs to also develop art because it's important to us to do that. Along with music, music has to be also part of the development of any movement. Otherwise, it's sort of like limps, a movement's limping if you don't have the art also developed by especially young people. So the reason I picked this was because I thought it was a model that we need to follow today. We need to establish, that kind of attitude in our communities and being conscious whether we're standing on this line or we're standing on this side of the community, but we all have a place, and so being conscious about what kind of contribution we're making to the resistance today in our communities.
Thank you so much, Omar. This is too unique a scenario and opportunity not to make it a more collective thing than we're used to in academia. I want to invite everyone into a conversation based on what you heard or what you didn't hear. I also want to acknowledge Juan. I didn't see you, but I saw Lilia. I knew you were here, so I figured I had to look over. But thanks for being here, and of course, Lilia, in her own right, incredible Chicago historian who can help us contextualize a lot of things too, hopefully. And I also want to acknowledge Paul Mireles of the New Era Young Lords. I feel like this is an opportunity for and all of you to have a deeper conversation about this idea of the image. So I'm just going to get us started with one question, but rather than kind of ask everyone a separate question, I want to invite just cross-dialogue and have really anyone share thoughts about this. I'll start out with you, Omar, because you did mention that you had the informalish designation of being Minister of Information for the Young Lords of Chicago. And I say that because it didn't quite work out. I think a lot of people want to believe that it was that strict and that, committed to the ministerial model, but that is just not how it worked here in the city of Chicago. But you were very invested in the idea of managing information for the Young Lords and curating and planning and thinking about how to convey messages. You worked on the newspaper, the Young Lords newspaper. This morning in my class, I'm teaching a class on state crimes, fun. We were looking at the history of COINTELPRO, and specifically, COINTELPRO New Left, and its strategy to sort of go after those newspapers, right, of social movements, looking for whatever evidence to actually create some type of concept that was the New Left, or just look for evidence of communism, and how hard that actually was for them. I think a lot of people think that it was, that it was easy for them to create lies, right? To foment this sort of environment of strategizing around antagonizing social movements. But I thought it was curious that they had to do a lot of scouring of newspapers and then curate and present a scenario that demonized these movements, right? In this case, it was like student movements. But I wanted to ask you about that, right? About the difficulty of managing information then, right? Protecting it from how it was being read or read wrong, and how that relates to now, managing information now in such a different way. AI is doing a number on how we're supposed to understand history and how we're supposed to understand the image. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first, a disclaimer. I was promoted to be the Minister of Information for the Young Lords from just being a gangbanger on division in Maplewood. And they gave me the title of Minister of Information because they were saying, well, you're the only one that graduated from high school, so you should know more. So that made me the Minister of Information. So I had to learn fast. And we knew one of the things that we needed to do internally was educate the members. So we needed to make sure that the members that came in understood why they were becoming Young Lords. And so one of the things that the newspaper would do was, to publish stories about, what was going on in Puerto Rico at the time, the whole fight against the ROTC, all the other types of movements that were going on, so that they would know how we were connected, to beyond Chicago. So that was part of it. The other part of it was informing the community about what we were doing to make sure that they understood why we were doing the things that we were doing. And the other part was coming up with slogans. We had to also come out with slogans that were catchy, and that taught. They had to be. We always wanted to be didactic about the things that we did. And I think that good example was that Tengo Puerto Rico en mi corazón. I think that was one of the very first things that came out of the organization, and still very much there. And of course, that those types of things is I managed, I guess, the creation of that, because it was a phrase that came out with Chacha, in conversations with Chacha and Ralph Rivera. We used to call him Spaghetti, and others. So it was a conversation that we had that then we came to the conclusion, this would be the slogan for the Young Lords. Tengo Puerto Rico en mi corazón. I think there was a lot of, we had to capture a lot of the things that were going on in Puerto Rico. And I think that might have been a phrase, that Ralph might have brought from Puerto Rico when he came. So, but managing the newspaper it was terrible. Again, because I knew nothing about journalism. But we knew that we had to put something together. And then the other part that was really more difficult was creating the newspaper. We had to type it. And then when you type a line and the next line it's not adjusted. So then if you, at the end of the line, you had 2 spaces from the one that was on top, then you had to adjust it and give it 2 spaces. So that when we would print it, it came out all adjusted. So we really, when creating a newspaper in those days was a task. And I think that explains why we were always finishing the newspaper at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, because we had to spend all that time. Then a machine came out that used to help us adjust those things. what do they, the word is not adjusted, it's
electric?
it was it was an electric machine, but it made columns. We didn't have to then just give it the extra space. And the other part is that when we did leaflets, we had to do them in a mimeograph. So, we had like a little thing that we used to draw the things on it and then type them and then reproduce them. So it was a task. It wasn't, being the Minister of Information wasn't glamorous. But, I had the help of a lot of the members. And so that's how we were able to put out the newspaper, put out posters, put up slogans. But we always wanted to make sure that there was a message, and we always wanted to be didactic about it. And I think that we were pretty successful in something like that.
Can we throw other conversations or other questions into the mix? Anybody want to take a shot at something, bring something up? I could go on forever, but I want to open it up. Anybody else or any of you have questions or additional thoughts about that? Or yeah.
I have a really straight to it question, which is just how many issues of the newspaper did you guys produce?
It was different with different numbers. I think that you usually would put out like 25,000, and it was a monthly publication for us. We couldn't produce something weekly; it would be impossible for us. But so we would do like 25,000, and that would be good for the members to go out and sell them and distribute them. So we did a lot of selling in the University of Chicago. We used to go to UC because it was very easy to have people give us 25 cents. Because it was a quarter, There it was easy. If we were in, at Sheffield and Armitage, it was more difficult to get 25 cents out of somebody. But that's how we dealt with it. It was 25,000 a month. That was it.
And in Chicago, there were 3 different titles that were produced. Ish, right? Because El Young Lord was in Milwaukee. It was produced when you all were in Milwaukee, but it started out the YLO, and then there was one that was called Pitirre, one issue of Pitirre, and then there was El Young Lord Latin Liberation Service, news service,
In
right?
Milwaukee, that was Milwaukee.
In Milwaukee. So there were like 3 different titles. In New York, it was just Palante. And that actually, not to put you on the spot, but you're here, man, But I've always kind of wondered about this, and I don't have the answer to it, but how did Palante become a cry of the Young Lords? It wasn't Chicago. I know people always associate Palante with just the Young Lords. And I always kind of look at them, you know that, Paul. I always say, Palante is not Chicago. And, it reminds me of your poster because, they just became the same story. They became, the Young Lords Party became the same story as the Young Lords Organization, became the same thing as the Young Lords. And then certain aspects, regional aspects, became part of the larger narrative, too. Where did Palante begin?
Wait, I want to give a microphone.
Yes, thank you.
Well, as I recall, this is like many years ago, but Palante was really a translation of the Panther slogan, "Right On." Right? So it was our translation of "Right On," which was a slogan that the Panthers used. It meant Palante, always, move forward, para adelante, and it was a contraction of para adelante, and so it became Palante, right on, and so that was I think it was because our first editor of the paper was Pablo Guzman, who passed away, then Denise, and then I think I was the 3rd editor, so that was the difference of it, and I think ours was a little different. We came out every 2 weeks. We didn't put out as many papers. We put out about 10, 15,000 every 2 weeks. But the big difference, I think, was that we required all Young Lords to sell 100 papers a day. That was part of how you went from being a lord in training to becoming a full-fledged lord. If you sold 100 papers a day at 25 cents each, you got $25. You gave half to the organization, and the other half you used to live on for your food and whatever, because you were expected to work 25 hours a day. That was the rules of discipline. So basically, the paper was the main sustenance of the organization economically. And as long as you could get 50, 60, 70, 100 people to sell 100 papers a day, you know, you'd be able to maintain the organization.
Right on, pa'lante. I love that. I mean, you know, I'm constantly learning. This is why these opportunities to come together, you know, in public spaces is so important because we remember things. And pa'lante, of course, also is just a beautiful word, right? Because, or, you know, and it's written almost like if it's one word, but it's such a Puerto Ricanism too, right? So the fact that it's inspired by the Black Panther Party, but written in Puerto Rican is fascinating, right? Anybody else?
Well, this is a question for Omar. Omar, are you writing your autobiography? I would suggest, I hope you do.
He has
As a
two
matter of
wonderful he has two wonderful essays in the forthcoming book, in the Young Lords Speak. One of them is actually a historical essay that we found unpublished. And the other one is a recollection of the Division Street Uprising of 1966, bird's eye view. So you definitely don't want to, not to like to overplug this book, but those are two really important essays and perspectives that just haven't been supported. But I am
Yeah, the one about on the Division Street Rebellion, what I wanted to do was just establish what the conditions were for, especially for young people in the community. You know, all the harassment from police and you know, being thrown in jail, being roughed up, and all of that just built up to the riots, to the rebellion in 1966. So I wanted to, you know, when I started writing that, my interest was in establishing what was going on that created that event, and also, you know, I want to say that those were the conditions that created the Young Lords. You know, the objective conditions. Then the Young Lords were able to move from there in Chicago, and other organizations that came out from there on. You know, there were other organizations that were very active in the community. LADO, that's when LADO was established, you know, Latin American Defense Organization, 1966. And that was the only organization that believed in direct action. You know, all the other ones negotiated. You know, they were trying to establish themselves as, you know, respectful. And LADO was the first one that said, nah, you know, so they went through direct action. And I think that also helped in the, well, the attitude that we had in the Young Lords. You know, it was, we always said, you know, we're equals to the police. You know, we're not going to be victims. We're not going to be the recipients. We're going to confront. And we always said, you know, the Chicago Police Department is a gang. We saw them as a gang. You know, so you have your colors. We have our colors. You have your leader. We have our leader. So we're equals. And that's when I think helped also in changing the mentality of the members, you know, where they began to see themselves no longer as the victims. You know, we were participants in a problem that, you know, we were dealing with. So, you know, that's what I intended to do in that writing. So I encourage you to buy the book.
That's great. Another thing that is actually featured in the book is the 50th anniversary logo that Areli designed unknowingly years before the 50th anniversary and was adopted by Cha-Cha when he had the movement in Michigan. And so he started using this image that Areli had produced, and it's part of the exhibition. You could take a look at it. But if you look at any of the materials of the Young Lords from about like 2016 16, 15 on, the logo is the logo that Areli designed when she was a student here at DePaul. And can you tell us what happened with the mural? How was it received? And I kind of want to hear a little bit about the aesthetic that you chose, because I know that you're an incredible painter, an incredible designer, but you approached the mural using a lot of the same type of like art, the sort of organic style and aesthetic of the People's Church murals, which I think is really, a lot of people, I don't know if you've seen images of the People's Church murals, but that's like almost exactly what it looked like. Those were very sort of organic images, right? They were painted by people like Felicitas Nunez. There was actually another muralist that also painted the logo of you mentioned him to me, John, the last time we talked. Several other actual artists and muralists who painted some of those murals at the People's Church. And they sort of got lost because the narrative is the Young Lords painted them, and that's true. According to Chacha, Young Lords painted them, but they were actually people from a lot of different sort of pathways and avenues that painted those. So can you speak about that? Maybe somebody else can talk about the murals at the People's Church?
Yeah, so my inspiration definitely came from my studies here at DePaul. I majored in art, media, and design, and I was close to majoring in Latin American history. But really being exposed to all those different art styles throughout the years that I was here, and also seeing all of the murals in like Pilsen and Little Village kind of spoke to me. So it was kind of like a mix of all that, and like you said, I wanted it to feel organic, of just kind of no starting, no ending, all just kind of fluid together. And I remember I presented this for my final. I don't recall much enthusiasm. I feel like I did a lot of political art while I was here, and that was not that common. I hope it is more common now and well received, but I did more, like you said, digital, which I love painting, drawing, but I felt like it wasn't very lucrative career. So I was trying to think like, okay, if I'm gonna spend all this money at DePaul, I should be able to make a living. So that's where I went more with digital media. And the logo, I really wanted to represent Afro-Latinos because, again, I feel even within Latinos, we do have some colorism. And I just kind of spoke from the heart, and since it was for DePaul, I couldn't have the iconic, gun in the background, so I ended up going with a pencil and a paintbrush because, again, it just kind of ties all this in, that the propaganda, we are the voices. We are the ones who will tell the story. And if we don't, then it will get erased.
Thank you. Anybody else want to talk about that?
I just brief comment. That Areli had a very intimate relationship to that kind of work, and I think that's one of the things about artists. When they are able to depict, the relationship they have to a community. So I think that's important. And I think that's important also, like in the case of John Weber. When you see these panels, for example, it didn't come out of John Weber's imagination. It was out of consultation with members of Lado who talked to him about the whole struggle, and then he put them on those panels. And I think that's really important for artists to do that. And of course, artists have that freedom to change things, to change symbols. John Weber, does that. I think that, I need to mention the policeman here. It says 1966, I think. 1966. Originally, it was 666.
There were some changes made.
Yeah. But, then, of course, you have to go with the times, I suppose. But, yeah, I think that intimate relationship between the community that you are, painting about, it's really important because it carries a lot of weight.
A couple of thoughts come to mind. First of all, Tengo Puerto Rico en mi corazón sure resonated with a homesick Boricua kid in a black and white neighborhood, but especially coming from people who are grounded here in the U.S., right? But there's something, Omar said that all movements create art. And I also want to add to that that art maintains movements, right? And maintains the memory of movements in between waves of movement. So that art creates artists as well as movements create artists, and the artists outlive the waves of movement because those come and go, right? They ebb and flow. And to the extent that they're able to maintain the memory and the stories and the narratives, right, that is available for future waves. So after I left, I moved to Minneapolis. Yeah, y'all have heard of it. I woke up there this morning in 1976 and was part of forming a collective of screen printing and other artists that lasted until 1979 to 2009, 30 years, going through ebbs and flows of history so that during the times when movements were at low ebb, we were maintaining those narratives. And so that when movements and we avoided the nonprofit thing. We didn't get grants, so yeah, we froze in the winter. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that as each new generation of movement came in, there were those stories preserved and those histories preserved. And I really was leading somewhere, but what, so that when we talk about looking back at history and try to remember it in its complexity, which can only be done if you're bringing the raw materials from those actual times. Like Omar says that being the Minister of Information was not glamorous. Spoiler alert, none of it is glamorous. Right, and that's one thing that I think is important for baby boomers to tell new generations is that each generation has its own particular pattern of brilliance and foolishness, right? And there are some things that were present in the movements of that day that have been lost on the battlefield, and things that new generations of activists have figured out that, oh my God, I only wish we had known back then. I think I'll leave it there. Oh yeah, I know what I want to say is that the preservation is the equivalent of tidal pools along the coast, that a tidal pool is the depression in the reefs or the rocks that maintains, protects marine life when the tide goes out. And that there are organizations, the Highlander Center in Tennessee, Northland, and many others that maintain those memories and histories and even revive them. It took me 50 years to get around to making a poster about Manuel Ramos. You know, he never left my memory, and I didn't know anyone else who remembered him. You know, since then, his family's been in touch and all that, but, bringing back what resonated with me, and, just like the songs that tell us who Joe Hill was, tell us who Joanne Little was, that we wouldn't know were it not for the art.
Thank you for that. I follow Ricardo so closely. I follow his work a lot because I like the news through his vision and his perspective. It feels strong and empowering, right? And I think in this day and age, like you can't always, there's not that many sources that help us find that. Democracy Now! Does. However, there's also, there's other really interesting ways to understand and consume current events right now. So I'm gonna ask one more quick question, and then because we're running out of time, and before that, I'm letting John add to this conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that that I've been very, very lucky that a bunch of the murals, a group of the murals that I was involved with. None of them were done entirely individually. There was always, more broader participation, but they were done in the Humboldt Park area have survived so far. On the other hand, the mural movement began in the center of the old South Side. and was started the mural movement, you know, that aside from Mexico, that had, you know, continued the, you know, the tradition that had begun in Italy, really, the Mexicans had, their murals had become part of their whole national sense of themselves. But in the United States, the murals have always had a fragile existence. And the mural movement, the worldwide mural movement, really began in Chicago in 1967, right, in the middle of the South Side, and almost all of those murals have been destroyed. Almost all of them. On the other hand, I've been very lucky that I was mostly working on the sort of near northwest side, and that has continued. It has, you know, survived. But you shouldn't think that the evidence of those years, the visual evidence of those years, is in some way guaranteed. It really isn't. It will only be preserved to the extent that people fight for it, actually.
And actually, that's somewhat connected to the question that I had for you, John. And let's see, how do I frame it? How does the city decide, or how do communities decide what to put on the walls? And this is connected to the fact that here we are in Chicago, the city, the birthplace of the Young Lords, and there are no murals of the Young Lords in the city of Chicago. Actually, there's one. There's one that wasn't completed in Humboldt Park. That has its own story that we'll save for now. But how are those decisions made, and what do you think is behind that? Any of you, really?
Well, while we used some public funds that we got initially really from the National Endowment, not from the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago has really been outside of this whole public art activity. It's been very, very tangentially involved. And most of the public art activity that was still continuing at a community level, because there were artists who were still related to the community, and the group that I helped found in 1970 with Bill Walker still exists and is still doing work, but most of the murals that you're going to see on major streets or facing major streets are completely individual work, and that really began during COVID, I believe. That there was a lot of communal work was suppressed during that period, and so a relative handful of people, of young artists who'd begun really as just spray can artists, as like the, you know, high school kids that are writing their names all over underpasses and so forth still, emerged and decided to really develop themselves as artists, and has a lot of some of their early work was around in Pilsen or near Pilsen, and now it's sort of all over the city. But that's not the same as the you know, communal and engaged and community-based work that was being done, that was started in Chicago with a wall of respect and continued, you know, with our work in Division Street and Humboldt Park and the Young Lords, etc. So there's been a real change and a loss. It's not a complete loss, but
That's a very telling cultural shift. Yeah, that's a really interesting cultural shift. And of course, this John's Fuertes Somos Ya, as far as most of us know, is the first time that the Young Lords were ever represented in art. So this is a really significant historical piece to us.
Yeah, I'd like to add something in terms of the production of art. I think what Omar said was critically important earlier. Chicago and Los Angeles really have a tremendous history of political murals. In New York City, there are murals, but they weren't really a major factor in sort of like politicizing people in the way they have been in Chicago or in LA. But where I think the Lords in New York and some of the other radical political organizations had an impact was in music. We were very, very involved with all the rising musicians of the salsa renaissance that developed in the late 60s and 70s. Willie Colon, Eddie Palmieri, Charlie Palmieri, Ray Barretto, Ruben Blades. They all played for us at very, very discounted prices to raise money for our organizations. And they also then took from the politics of the organization for their music. You know, Eddie Palmieri's Justicia album was a direct result of all of the work that we were doing. In fact, Eddie Palmieri told me years later that he and his family attended the First Spanish Methodist Church, which is the church that the Young Lords in New York City took over. So his family was part of that congregation. And of course, the poetry, you know, Pedro Pietri and several other of Eddie Figueroa and the New York Village Cafe people, they were all influenced and took the inspiration from the Lords for their poetry. So I think in New York City, it was more the poetry and the music that was the main outlet for amplifying the political movement and bringing in artists more than the painting or the murals as in Chicago or in LA.
They were sort of thriving together at the same time. Juan, I heard that, I think it was maybe Felipe had gone with Fania, had toured with, or had gone to one of the major Fania concerts in Africa or something like that.
Yeah, and both Felipe and Mickey were very, very involved with sort of like the people who developed Fania. And the state maintained relations with them. And of course, both of them became major DJs of Latin music. And
Vámonos Pa'l Monte, supposedly that's a song about the Young Lords, right? So that's fascinating. There's a whole, I'm telling you that there's so much more to discover and to explore in this very rich history. We definitely have gone over time, but I think one more question is definitely in order, and then I think we have to lock it up, right? We have to lock it up, but maybe we'll have a chance to talk afterward too. Okay.
It's not a question.
Oh,
I know
great.
Cardo from when he was 15 years old.
Who? I'm sorry?
Ricardo.
Ricardo.
Back then I
wow.
called him Cardo. And I'm certainly looking forward to the book on the Young Lords being published by Haymarket, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't let you know about Cardo's book that just came out in 2025.
Beautiful book.
And there's a section in there called Life in the Tide Pools, if you were curious about that.
And follow him on Instagram. I'm telling you, he gives me my news every week. Yes. And since I promised one more quick question, do you have a quick question that you can finish off the night for us with?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's such an honor to be in your presence. I just wanted to know, I feel like Chicago has a lot of hidden landmarks that we don't know about. Are there any landmarks that you feel like haven't been acknowledged or that we should know about in Lincoln Park that dealt with the Young Lords?
I know that the church is no longer there. It's a Walgreens now, so that part is gone. I'm glad that they didn't do away with a stone building, which is now the music. That was the one that we took over. So that one exists. But People's Park, you know, the headquarters of the Young Lords organization is gone. So some of what could have been landmarks, really physical landmarks, are gone. And I think that there's kind of like a movement to begin to map them out and then do something like landmarks. We have one big one here across by the music building. You know, that's a big win. That's a big
that
one.
was a big win. The historical marker, it's the only one in the city. The Legacy Walk has a tribute or a pylon dedicated to Sylvia Rivera, and that's the closest to the Young Lords affiliation that we have in the city. And of course, Sylvia Rivera was from New York. And then, of course, you know, if you look at the history of the Young Lords through the lens that people like Omar and Cha-Cha looked at it, which was that it has not stopped, then you have, you know, the People's Law Office, even though the geography has shifted, the history is embedded in that. And so, you know, we can't always rely on geography, on spatial geography to tell us stories, right? People do landmarking in empty spaces all the time. It's, you know, they become kind of like ghost tours where we're like, this Capital One building used to be the People's Park, right? So there's that exercise of the imagination, which is in many ways the message behind Tengo Lincoln Park en mi corazón. It's actually asking you to close your eyes as you look at this too and imagine, right? How things used to be and how things can be moving forward. That's really what the invitation is. But we also have places like San Lucas Church of Christ on North Avenue, which became a really important site for, you know, later years for the organization, right? Whether it was during the Howard Washington years and Cha-Cha's involvement with that. So really, and I think that just to close, I'll say that in many ways, that's gonna be the challenge for people in reading the Young Lords speak. Because for so long, there was this narrative that said that the Young Lords movement ended in 1972, right? And that Chicago just didn't have anything to add to that conversation, right? And the way that we decided to approach it was to help people understand that there was work that continued and that at no point in time, I mean, certainly anybody who ever worked with Cha-Cha and spoke to him never heard him talk about former Young Lord anything or former chairman. In his view and in his way of telling the story, it really was a struggle that continued and reinvented itself and had a lot of iterations and a lot of tactics that were really necessary in a system that was so committed to disrupting the protracted struggle. And so he imagined himself like having to sort of reinvent it time and again, and sometimes just standing on his own. Sometimes it was just him, right? Or sometimes it was just him and Omar, right? It was, but in his view, it really was something lasting. And so I think the invitation is for us to, you know, look for those landmarks in a lot of different places, not just in geographic spaces and buildings and such, the way that we tend to memorialize things.
Yeah, we probably won't be able to get away with knocking that bank down. But how about finding another empty lot? 'Cause I think a People's Park would be a great tribute to that history.
That would be lovely. That would be lovely. Maybe
And
renaming
I'd
a few
come back and
things.
plant trees again, you know?
I did hear that the Walgreens was thinking of closing down. But on that note, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thanks for staying a little longer. Really appreciate you. Please take advantage and come back to look at Tengo Lincoln Park en mi corazón. Bring your friends, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.